Ashtanga Yoga, one of the most misinterpreted words in the modern day yoga world. We're going to talk about why that is. So as a yoga student and as a yoga teacher, it's important to understand some of the words, some of the terms that you hear in class. Definitely teachers will be throwing at you in class, Chaturanga, Shavasana, and definitely the word Ashtanga. When you understand the meaning of these words, it's going to give you a better understanding of your practice. So the word Ashtanga, if you ask many yoga students and yoga teachers, what is Ashtanga Yoga? They'll tell you that it's a Hatha yoga system created about 90 years ago by a man named, very powerful, very important yogi named Pattabhi Jois, and he created 6 sequences from beginning to advanced. And they're not wrong by saying this is Ashtanga Yoga because he branded his style of yoga and he borrowed the word from Patanjali, who we're going to talk about in a little bit. So before I tell you about why that's a misinterpreted word, let's give the Ashtanga yogis, Pattabhi Jois, and many of the Western yogis that have followed on his path, Richard Freeman, Duggan David Swenson, Beryl Bender Birch, who wrote a wonderful book called Power Yoga back in the mid-90s. It was definitely Ashtanga based, even though she didn't call it Ashtanga Yoga. I heard she was actually ostracized by the Ashtanga community because she didn't use the word. Very similar to what happened with the Bikram rule. But these are some of the most amazing yogis that I've ever seen. Their practice, their concept of alignment. Pattabhi Jois was a master, a yoga addict, and so were the people that I just mentioned that have carried on his teachings and continue to carry on his teachings, even though he passed away a few years ago. The Ashtanga Yoga community is one of the most amazing, well-respected community in the yogic world. I'm definitely not making them wrong. Very powerful and very influential yogis. Now, before I tell you the next tip, I want you to hit the subscribe button, hit the like button if you're enjoying this video, share it with your friends. You want to learn all about hot yoga, history, factoids, tutorials, and flows. Hit the subscribe button right now. So like I said before, his yoga was influenced by his teacher, his guru, Krishnamacharya. And they came from the city of Mysore down in the southern part of India, and that's where this particular yoga came from. Now, Krishnamacharya had 3 very influential students. One was a Iyengar who created his version, his approach of Krishnamacharya's teaching. He called it a Iyengar yoga. Then there was Desikachar, who happened to be Krishnamacharya's son. His approach was a little different. He called Vinyasa Yoga. And the third, the person we were talking about before, Pattabhi Jois, had a little different approach than Iyengar and Desikachar, and he branded his yoga Ashtanga Yoga. And that's where the misinterpretation lies, because he chose that particular word. So once again, definitely not making them wrong. Some of the most amazing yoga teachers in the world. Many other yoga teachers have borrowed Sanskrit words to brand their style of yoga. John Friend used the word Anusara, which means to open your heart to the divine will of grace. The Sikhs borrowed the word Kundalini to brand their approach to yoga, Kundalini Yoga. Have you ever taken a Kundalini class? David Life and Sharon Gannon, they borrowed the word Jivamukti, which means self-realized master. They borrowed the word Jivamukti to brand their style of yoga. Once again, Sanskrit words to describe their approach. So see if I can clarify a little bit more what I'm talking about. If you ask that same yoga student or that same yoga teacher, what is the 8-limb path? They will tell you that it's Patanjali's. He compiled these 8 limbs, influenced by the Eightfold Path of Buddhism, 2,000 years ago, and he wrote the Yoga Sutras. He called them Yoga Sutras because sutra actually means suture or thread. But in the Yoga Sutras was the 8-limb path that he compiled and put together. And it was the first time the yogis actually had a systematized roadmap that they could follow in order to reach the final stage of yoga of samadhi, self-realization, and God realization to find enlightenment. So this was his prescription on getting to that path and finding enlightenment. Back to the word Ashtanga Yoga. So you ask the yoga teacher, the yoga student, what's the 8-limb path? They'll tell you Patanjali. Then they say, what's Ashtanga Yoga? They tell you about 90 years ago, Pattabhi Jois' sequence. Herein lies the problem. Herein lies the misinterpretation. Because the 8-limb path, 8 in Sanskrit is Asht, and in German is Ak, Ang is limb. For example, if you're doing a Vinyasa class and you hear the word, Sanskrit word Chaturanga, Chatur is 4, Ang is limb. So Asht 8, Ang limb.
Now it's starting to make some sense.
The true Ashtanga Yoga was 2,000 years ago that Patanjali compiled, didn't create, because all the components have been around for thousands of years before Patanjali, but he put them together in the Yoga Sutras in the 8-limb path. This is the real Ashtanga Yoga. It's not necessarily a problem, just a misinterpretation of why Pattabhi Jois chose the 8-limb path to brand his style of Hatha Yoga.
Oh, I'm so confused!
And screwed everybody up. Now, if you go back to the original teachings of Patanjali and why he chose the word Ashtanga, why he chose the 8 limbs, which again was influenced by the Buddhist Eightfold Path, these were steps for the yogi to find enlightenment. 2,000 years ago, when Patanjali was putting together this system, and that's why they called his system classical yoga, by the way, because he systematized the subject, thus giving the subject its classical form. So now Patanjali puts together the 8-limb path, and he does choose asana as his third path. But when Patanjali chose the word asana, he was talking about, one, keeping the body healthy, because he was definitely a proponent of keeping the body healthy, unlike a lot of the traditionalists that thought the body was a distraction for our self-realization because it kept us in desire, which then kept us separate from God. So Patanjali said, keep the body healthy so you could sit in meditation for long periods of time. He also said, this is really important, this is where a lot of the misinterpretation comes in. He also said, be very still in your asana. Now, if you look at Pattabhi Jois' approach to Hatha Yoga, very much influenced by his teacher, Krishnamacharya, it was very much about Vinyasa, which was a continuous flow and a continuous movement. Therefore, going against what Patanjali was saying about being still in your asana. Now, he wasn't contradicting Patanjali, it was just a different approach to the subject, because Patanjali was talking about quieting the mind so you can find the connection to the universe and find the connection with God. He wasn't talking about opening up the body and opening up the channels of the body to raise and awaken pranic and kundalini shakti energy, which was the Hatha Yoga approach. It was different than Patanjali. Now, had Pattabhi Jois used his name, like his colleague BKS Iyengar did, and called it Pattabhi Jois Yoga, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. But because he chose the word Ashtanga Yoga, now I believe that people have a misunderstanding of what the true meaning of the word means. So then you may say, well, why did he choose the word Ashtanga Yoga to brand his style of his approach to yoga, his approach to Hatha Yoga? Well, Krishnamacharya, his teacher, I was reading in Desikacharya's book, I forgot the name of the book, but I'll put it here as you can see the name later, and Desikacharya wrote about his dad, Krishnamacharya, and what he said was his main influence was Patanjali's 8-limb path. So now here Krishnamacharya is teaching his students all about Patanjali in the 8-limb path, the first roadmap that the yogis were handed to follow to reach that final stage of enlightenment. So then Pattabhi Jois just used that word Ashtanga Yoga based on his teachings from Krishnamacharya. But they're talking about getting to the final stages of yoga, because Pattabhi Jois' prescription was not doing Hatha Yoga the way we do it now in America, the way we do it now in the West. Definitely had nothing to do with Vinyasa. And if you watch the video I did a few weeks ago on Hatha Yoga, the Hatha Yoga philosophy and intention was to awaken an energy inside of us that lays dormant in most people. It's called the Kundalini Shakti. It lays down at the very base of the spine. And the Hatha Yogis aspire to awaken that energy up the center channel or the Sushumna Nadi.
It's a female snake.
That's how we will find our connection with the universe and our connection with God. It was definitely a different approach than Patanjali. Patanjali's prescription was for the yogi to go up into the caves of the Himalayas in meditation and contemplation, quieting the mind to find the connection with the universe. It was a different prescription. The Hatha Yogis had a different approach. Nobody's right, who's wrong, everyone's right, they have their own interpretation. Now, if Pattabhi Jois would have called his yoga Dviyanga, Dvi is two, that's pretty much following his method, his interpretation. Because if you go to an Ashtanga class down the street, most likely you're going to be doing asana and pranayama. Those are the two main limbs of Patanjali's 8-limb path that you're practicing in that classroom. Now, the argument would be, well, we embody the 8-limb path in our practice. If it's not in the yoga teachings, it's definitely in our own personal practice, our own spiritual sadhana or path. That's not what they're mostly teaching in the classroom. Maybe they'll mention other limbs in the 8-limb path. But surprisingly enough, in the Hatha Yoga world, they have a little different path. They call it the Sapta Sadhana, or the 7th path. They don't call it 7 limbs, they call it the 7th path. The Sapta Sadhana is a little different than Patanjali. Here's Patanjali's list of the 8-limb path. Here's the Sapta Sadhana list. A little different. You can sort of juxtapose them. The yamas and the yamas, they group together as one, the first path. Asanas, 2. They bring in the mudras and the bandhas as 3. These are also physical movements or seals or locks to awaken that energy up that center channel, sushumna. Then they bring in pratyahara before pranayama. So they juxtapose it. And for whatever reason, the sapta sadhana leaves out concentration, dharana. They go right to meditation, dhyana. And then the 7th limb is samadhi, similar to Patanjali. So you can see the similarities between the two. Now, don't think, this is another thing I don't, and maybe I'll do a video on Patanjali another day, but don't think that the yamas and the niyamas, pratyahara, pranayama, belong to Patanjali. He just borrowed those particular limbs to brand his approach. Very similar to Bikram yoga, for example. Bikram didn't create standing hitini and standing bow. Those postures were around hundreds of years before Bikram came around. He just took those poses and put them in a sequence to brand his style of yoga, which he smartly called Bikram yoga. So his approach of yoga is not confusing. It's just his approach. Iyengar yoga, Bikram yoga, Barkan yoga. We chose our names to brand our particular approach to yoga. And had Pattabhi Jois said Pattabhi Jois yoga, like I said before, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So I'm not necessarily making Pattabhi Jois wrong for using that word. I'm just saying it was confusing because the real Ashtanga Yoga, Asht, 8, Ang, limb, Patanjali's 8-limb path, that's the true meaning of Ashtanga Yoga. Pattabhi Jois, only 90 years ago, not 2,000 years ago like Patanjali, borrowed the word to brand his style of Hatha Yoga. So now when you hear the word Ashtanga Yoga, you'll have a better understanding of what that word truly means. Even though, don't run into that Ashtanga Yoga class down the street and say, hey guys, you're wrong, you shouldn't be calling it Ashtanga Yoga. For goodness sakes, don't do that. We don't want to make anybody wrong. I made a whole video on that. Check that out after you watch this one. Ashtanga Yoga is Patanjali, not necessarily Pattabhi Jois. So that's our video for today. Thank you so much for watching. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. Hit the notification bell. Smash the like button if you enjoy this video. Share it with your friends. If you want to learn all about hot yoga and all about the factoids and flows, make sure you hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in the next video. Bye, everyone.